Alright, so this is the full view of the sheep brain. We're going to start with the lobes of the cortex. The first one, you have the frontal lobe, that's in the front. That will be responsible for decision making and primarily for motor function. As you move backwards, in this area, you have the parietal lobe, which is primarily for somatosensory integration. Coming back further near the backside of these points, you have the occipital lobe, and that'll be primarily for visual integration. As we look to the side, this darker area right here, this is the temporal lobe, and that'll be primarily for auditory and memory function. Splitting the two hemispheres, you have the longitudinal fissure. So this area right here. On the cortex, you have these noodle-like things, and then the spaces in between them. So the noodles are as a gyrus, or multiple gyri, and the space in between them is a sulcus. Alright. So as we move away from the cortex, you could start to see a couple other structures. Back here, you could see the superior colliculus, or colliculi, and inferior colliculus. They all, collectively, they'll make up the corpus quadragemini, and they're part of the midbrain. Continuing going back, you have the cerebellum, primary function being balance and coordination. You have two lateral hemispheres, and in the middle you have the vermis. And that's it for the top part, superior view. So now if we go to inferior view, you look towards the front and you have cranial nerve number 1. So this is your olfactory bulb or olfactory nerve, and it's responsible for olfaction, which means smelling. Then moving backwards, you have both optic nerves, cranial nerve number 2, and they meet and cross at this junction right here, which is the optic chiasm. Moving down, you could see this structure right here is the pituitary gland, and if you remember, that's the gland that sits in the sella turcica. If we peel this entire structure back, which is the dura mater, you could see the brainstem, the entire brainstem. The piece closest to the cortex is the midbrain right here. Moving down this bump right here, you have the pons and then the medulla. So you go midbrain, pons, medulla, and coming off the medulla, you have the spinal cord. Alright, so now we have the lateral view of the brain, or the sagittal view. So they made a cut down the longitudinal fissure so you can see the other half, inside half of the brain. So the first bit we have right here, wrapping all the way around the corpus callosum, which helps with communication between the two hemispheres. Going inferior to that, this little slightly darker shaded color, this is the thalamus, which is a relay station for all of the information in the brain. And then below that, you have the hypothalamus, and that's where that is. Moving above the thalamus, so here's the thalamus, moving above it, you'd have the epithalamus, which is more commonly known as the pineal body or pineal gland. Moving more posteriorly, we could see another view of only one of the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus is more responsible for visual reflexes, so when you see something out of the corner of your eye, you'll react to it. And the inferior colliculus is more responsive to auditory. It integrates auditory reflexes, so if someone slams a book on the table, you immediately will look to that because of that auditory reflex. On the sagittal cut of the cerebellum, you can see this tree-like structure, which is known as the arbor vitae, Latin for tree of life. And then looking down at this this long structure, this is your brainstem, just from a different view. So if you remember from the other video, you have midbrain, pons, medulla, and then spinal cord, which is not part of the brainstem. So midbrain, pons, medulla. Lastly, we have all the ventricles. So inside of the corpus callosum, you see the lateral ventricle. It's an empty space that has cerebral spinal fluid. So that's what all the ventricles are, an empty space. So here's the lateral ventricle.
This here, this opening around the thalamus, is the third ventricle. This space here, under the superior colliculus, is the cerebral aqueduct. And this here, under the cerebellum, is the fourth ventricle. The central sulcus here divides the frontal lobe of the brain from the parietal lobes, just as the coronal suture of the skull divides the frontal bones from the parietal bones.